The conversation on UFOs, UAPs, and non-human intelligence has long been shaped by experience, speculation, and secrecy. What's missing is a coherent approach, one that separates data from interpretation and evidence from belief. Humanity now stands at a threshold. Encountering a non-human reality is not only a scientific mystery, it's a civilizational challenge. We must move beyond ideology and secrecy toward a science of contact, grounded in evidence, methods, and shared human values. The Human Institute is building that foundation. The Investigating Non-Human Intelligence series is the first public multidisciplinary forum dedicated to developing the scientific and ethical foundations for researching our human encounter with non-human intelligence. The series convenes leading scientists, philosophers, and field investigators to explore new approaches, methods, and emerging data and findings to ultimately generate breakthrough discoveries in non-human intelligent phenomena. These one-hour presentations bring forward serious work by serious people, charting a roadmap for a new science capable of understanding and managing the unknown responsibly before it manages us. We invite scholars, experiencers, and all who seek clarity to join us. It's time to rise above speculation and take a deliberate step toward a grounded, evidence-based response to the existence of non-human intelligence.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural presentation of the Investigating Non-Human Intelligence series, an initiative of the Human Institute presented in partnership with UAP Med. My name is Reed Summers, and on behalf of the Human Institute, I'd like to welcome you to today's event, which is the first in a series of presentations and panel discussions exploring what may be one of the most important questions of our time. Are we encountering technologies of non-human origin and potentially a non-human intelligence? Today marks the beginning of a journey, one that will bring together leading minds in science, research, and investigation to lay the intellectual groundwork for what may become a new field of inquiry, non-human intelligence. Within this new forum will be presented the methodologies, frameworks, and investigatory practices necessary to build a credible and evidential basis for assessing the existence, the presence, the activity, and the intent of a potential non-human intelligence. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to the Human Institute. Here at the Human Institute, our mission is to bring the study of UAP and potential NHI out of the shadows of secrecy and speculation and into the light of rigorous public discourse. We seek to accelerate humanity's response to the realities and implications of emerging phenomena with empirical rigor and strategic foresight, building the foundations for an informed, safe, and united human response to our potential engagement with a non-human reality. To achieve this, the Human Institute is designing solutions in the human interest, working to gather new data sets, undertake empirical research and analysis, and to develop cutting-edge products and platforms, all to bridge key gaps in society's capacity and capability to contend with this new reality. At the same time, we're working to translate essential findings into actionable insights for policymakers and the private sector. Currently, our global responses to UAP and potential NHI are siloed within national security frameworks, which are structures developed in response to our human tendency toward competition and conflict, not in response to our collective encounter with the unknown. The Human Institute's goal is to advance humanity's capacity to contend with the unknown collectively and responsibly in light of our shared human values for stability, security, and sovereignty. And through this, we aim to support humanity's greater journey into the new realities of the cosmos and the transformative challenges and opportunities it will surely present. The Human Institute is bringing forward 3 initiatives, and one of which is the Investigating NHI panel and presentation series, which you are attending today. We are also hosting a UAP Technology and Policy Summit next February 2026. And we're also building a platform called UFOevidence.com, which will be a world-class repository of evidence, a strength of evidence scoring system, as well as a narrative onboarding for the public into phenomena related to UAP. So with that, welcome to Investigating Non-Human Intelligence. With me here is Ted Rowe, Executive Director and founder of UAP Med, whose leadership and partnership, frankly, have been instrumental in making this event possible. Ted, I'd like to welcome you to the stage. And please share a little bit about UAP Med, your work, and the series.
Sure. About me first, I've been a longtime UFO researcher. I am the executive director of narcap.org. I'm a co-founder of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics UAP program, and a founder of UAP Med, which was established to inform professionals and academics about the reality of UAP, as well as advocate for policy and procedural changes to support UAP witnesses. So, and finally, our other process would be to network with other organizations that have similar goals and aspirations.
Excellent, Ted. Well, it's been a pleasure working with you to provide this new forum for the public. This is one of the first truly public multidisciplinary forums for building the intellectual, the ethical, and the scientific foundations to examine this potential engagement that may be taking place between humanity and a non-human intelligence. And Ted, you and I have worked closely to lay out a roadmap of investigation and research and to bring forward the best minds across many different disciplines as we chart this path forward. And there are 8 layers of this emerging field that we will be exploring over the next 1 to 2 years in this series. Put those on screen in a moment. Scientific and research foundations, signs of intelligence, consciousness and cognitive frontiers, communication and contact, psychological and social impacts, exposure and direct encounters, public safety and responsible engagement, ethics, law, and international preparedness. So this is the roadmap for the Investigating NHI series. And as we'll hear from today's speaker, Michael Cifone, who will be delivering the inaugural talk of the series, we will be examining the scientific and research foundations for this new inquiry and this new potential science of non-human intelligence. While SETI scans the stars for signals of an extraterrestrial form of life, we also must scan our earthly skies and oceans, as well as our human experience, for signs that NHI, a non-human intelligence, may already be here interacting with humanity. And here I can say, we are crossing a threshold from speculating about what might be out there to confronting evidence that strongly suggests engagement may already be occurring, whether consciously or unconsciously. And the Investigating NHI series will bring together scientists, philosophers, researchers, investigators, experiencers, and clinicians to share emerging findings, data, and key perspectives to advance this new field. Each session of the Investigating NHI series will address a distinct layer of this new field, one of those 8 foundational layers. And for the general public, I think this series offers a tremendous opportunity to build an intellectual framework and basis for assessing the reality of the phenomenon, claims that are made regarding non-human entities, and to basically think through the enigmatic nature of what this phenomenon is presenting to us. Beyond that, it's going to provide empirical anchors for assessing this independently and bridging the gap between expert research and lived experience, recognizing that experiencers are vital sources of qualitative data, not just fringe observers of this phenomenon. So in closing, and I'll transition over to Ted in a moment, the outcome of these efforts, my hope, is that it is nothing less than the emergence of a new field of study, a science of contact, both empirical and grounded in the ethics and human values that unite us all in our encounter with the unknown. So with that, welcome to Investigating Non-Human Intelligence and the Journey Ahead. Ted, if you would please introduce our first speaker in the series, and I'll let you take it from there.
Our first speaker is Dr. Michael Cifone, PhD and founder, CAO of Society for UAP Studies, editor-in-chief of Lamina, and a philosopher of science. And we look forward to hearing his perspective on how science has to grow and adapt to understanding non-human intelligence while avoiding anthropic traps. So with that, I think we hand it over to Jason.
Well, hello, everybody. First and foremost, I want to thank you, Reed and Ted, and everybody actually on the team for putting this together. This is something that's very near and dear to so many people's hearts. And since we're never going to get real disclosure from the powers that be, it's time that civilians take the helm and start off somewhere. This initiative is so brilliant, and I'm happy to be part of this. So thank you so much. I can't think of a better guest to kick off this series than Mike Cifone. First and foremost, when it comes down to merging science and philosophy, at some point they diverged when there should be one and the same. And Mike understands this more than anybody in the field of research of UAPs. We need to have philosophy, spirituality, and physical science all merged together as one, because if we eliminate one, we'll end up eliminating a bunch of others. So without further ado, I'm going to read Mike's bio here. Hopefully I don't screw it up. I just did receive it, but I will read his bio here for you guys. So Mike Cifone, Dr. Mike Cifone, is the founder and CEO of the Society for UAP Studies. He's also the editor-in-chief of Lamina. Dr. Mike Cifone is a leading scholar in the emerging academic study of unidentified aerial phenomenon, also known as UAP. He holds a PhD in history and philosophy of science from the University of Maryland, College Park, of course. Dr. Cifone currently focuses entirely on UAP studies, especially the conceptual foundations of the emerging science of UAPs, which he takes to include both physical and experiential dimension. He's currently a visiting researcher and fellow at the Center of Advanced Study at Friedrich Alexander University in Erlangen, England. Hopefully I didn't mess up that city name too bad. His work emphasizes building theory frameworks and integrating science, conceptual, epistemological, that's one I've never said out loud before, perspectives in studying anomalous phenomenon. He's established a Society for UAP Studies and founded Lamina, the Journal of UAP Studies, and its editor-in-chief. So without further ado, Mike, I would like to invite you on this special program. And of course, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's a little bit later for you than it is for us here on the West Coast. You are in Germany. So we thank you so much for your time, of course.
Thanks, Jason. And you'll let me know if I'm not loud enough, but usually I talk too loud, so it shouldn't be a problem. Thanks very much, Jason. Yes, it's Erlangen, Germany. And yes, it's a little late here, so I hope to have my stamina throughout the evening. It will be past midnight soon enough. Also, thank you, Reed, and especially Ted, for your very kind introduction. I'm becoming very interested in this question of non-human intelligence. And earlier today, the Society hosted a colloquium with a scholar of South Asian philosophical traditions, in which specifically we spoke about the various non-human intelligences that are part of those traditions, and which have been a part of those traditions, of course, for many millennia. Of course, that we consider those traditions to be religion and philosophy. And what is interesting here is that we're in the modern era, right, to discuss non-human intelligence is always from a distance. a safe distance. And this has been sort of the approach of SETI, is to assume that if it exists, it is non-local, right? It's quite far. But here, there seems to be a pathway from UAP studies in terms of the empirical characterization and, sort of the scientific engagement of these phenomena as objects in outer space, right? In space here on Earth, and some of these cases seem to be very suggestive of the operation of some form of intelligence, and this brings the question of non-human intelligence very close, right? And so, there's that joke, not in my backyard, NIMBY, right? And for SETI, it's like not in our backyard, but if it's distant, okay, we can sort of deal with it. So here we have to kind of start to encounter this nearby, right? And that's what's interesting. In the modern era, we just have banished that as a possibility on the Earth for various reasons. So that's what's really interesting about this, is that we sort of cross from religion and spirituality right into the heart of science itself, and have to try to situate the question of non-human intelligence as not a non-local phenomenon at a distance, but rather as a local phenomenon right up close here on the Earth. The question, however, is how do we do that, right? We have to chart a path from the kinds of evidence and the challenges that are faced with the sorts of data and evidence that we might think that we have, to get to the point, right, to where we can be fairly confident that, in fact, what we are dealing with, at least in some subset of these unidentified aerial or anomalous phenomena, that in fact what we may be dealing with is a non-human intelligence. And if that is the case, then the question is, how do we study that as a matter of science, right? Science doesn't study non-human intelligence that is not at least as intelligent as we are, right? We don't have a science that examines an intelligence that might be more advanced or more ambiguous to even detect or encounter, right? So these are the sorts of challenges that I'm going to try to lay out tonight or today, wherever you are in the world. So that's some preliminary. I have a lecture prepared, so I'm gonna if first I beg your pardon that I will read some things, and maybe I will ad lib some parts of the talk. But what we're going to do here is try to find that pathway, because I don't study non-human intelligence in the sense of an advanced non-human intelligence. Nobody really does, in a sense, right? There really is no science of that kind, and it's worth thinking what it would look like to arrive at such a science from where we are now, right? Respecting the sorts of data and evidentiary limits that we are faced with. Okay, so since I have to apologize, since I don't study non-human intelligence, not even animal intelligence, which you might think, well, that's non-human, that's still kind of in this category. Of course, we mean something much broader than that. Extraterrestrial, non-terrestrial intelligence is probably a more accurate expression, and perhaps more advanced, right? So since I don't study NHI specifically, I have to begin with a few provisos and perhaps a small apology. As you've already heard, and as some of you may know, my field now is what is emerging as UAP studies, which has many kinds of branches. It's an interdisciplinary, it's a partly scientific, also a scholarly pursuit of what are called unidentified aerial or undersea or now anomalous phenomena. It's worth sort of worrying a little bit about the term anomalous. I'm not quite sure if I'm comfortable with using the term anomalous it might be misleading. It's not that it's wrong per se, but there certainly are anomalies, obviously, but the word can perhaps prematurely close down the very process of inquiry that we need most, right? So I'm a little hesitant here. It's ironic, of course, since anomaly or the anomalous would already seem to be, a wide open term. But this indeterminateness, I think, might be a kind of trap all unto itself. It can make us think that we already know what kind of thing we're dealing with or what we're not dealing with. So I'd rather keep the field a little bit even wider open, a little longer before we name it. So I actually think saying unidentified aerial or undersea phenomena is a little bit better, right, in that regard. So the alternative we might call tentative, something, tentative naming in relation to specific data, cases, testimonies, and so on, the beginnings of a taxonomy. So I think it's better to maybe stick more closely with what people are reporting they see. I mean, sometimes they see structured objects, so UFOs maybe. Sometimes they see stuff that it's harder to describe, so maybe it's more like a phenomenon, right, which is a little bit more neutral, and it indicates the struggle to even describe what it is that we're seeing, right? So there's a whole wide variety of things here, right? Yes, it's anomalous, but it's better, I think, to be a little bit more specific in terms of the qualitative description of the things that are being reported. So, I mean, that's a whole lecture on itself. And this, I think, would require some philosophical interventions right here. And this, when you start worrying about how it is that we're actually describing the phenomena, going to the source of that description, which is human experience, right? There's where you start to do phenomenology. And my colleague, for example, at the Society for UAP Studies, Dr. Kimberly Engels, has taught for us a number of courses on the subject and is herself, I think, pioneering the application of this very rich and sophisticated philosophical tradition of the engagement with and the attempt to describe as accurately as possible the structure of the experience of the world, and in particular here of what you might call, the empirical weird, the UAP. So that's a whole other topic. But this is why I'm sort of taking a moment to pause on that, because naming is, in a sense, there's a kind of violence because you close something down when you name it, instead of, in this case, because the phenomena are so elusive and so difficult even to characterize, it's important, I think, to think about language and where that's coming from, namely the experience that people are having when they encounter these phenomena. In fact, that's why I love to use the term that Hynek himself reached for in what I consider to be one of the great texts in this field. He called it the UFO experience, right? And that's what it really is. I mean, all science begins, all religion begins as an experience, right? So I think it's useful just to kind of even pause right there. So I begin here not as an expert in NHI, but as a philosopher and researcher working on the conceptual and methodological foundations of a potentially young science, right? For me, it's a science of UAP, but in this lecture, I want to move from UAP to this question of non-human intelligence. It is a young science, a proto-science, you might even say, that is in development right now, right, as we speak. So you can advance the slide. So what I'm really interested in is a historical phenomenon, I think, that we're witnessing in terms of a transition between two different, you could call them styles, two different sort of modes of engagement with what were called UFO, what are called now UAP. again, I think it's really important to take a moment here to reflect, right, on the historical moment that we're seeing. And, what are we seeing? We're seeing more and more academics, more and more scientists, right? Traditional scientists who have, traditional credentials in their particular subfield of the natural sciences, the physical sciences. We're seeing more and more scientists engage more seriously with the question of UAP. Of course, it goes back almost a decade, right, as it became clear that, the U.S. government and in fact, many other governments all around the world, France, for example, Belgium, many governments in Latin America, have recorded phenomena that are, as Obama said once, that we don't know what it is. They manifest strange, often elusive characteristics that seem to exceed the known performance envelope of any kind of airborne or even undersea technological structures, right? In the best cases, right, you've got clearly structured craft, like in the Nimitz, the famous 2004 Nimitz case, which we'll talk about a little bit later, right? You've got craft that are being recorded, things that look like craft, objects that are that seem structured, that they're exchanging electromagnetic energy on radar, et cetera, right? Performing just incredible feats of kinematic, pyrotechnics, as it were. That sort of has woken folks up to, that was what kind of got me interested in this, that look, despite the fact that, yes, there are, the evidence is largely testimonial, it's hard to gain access to a lot of these the sensor data because it's classified for very, very specific and understandable reasons. And notwithstanding the problem of overclassification, of course. But it's clear that there are objects that are real, that are being recorded, that are hard to explain, if not impossible seemingly impossible to explain. So more and more, right, scientists are getting interested in that, right, in bringing to bear the traditional structures of research and data gathering, instrumented observations, right, putting instruments, well-calibrated, well-characterized instruments on the problem, right? And this represents, in my view, this emergence of a kind of a science, right, around this phenomenon, trying to deploy observational and even experimental sciences. This, to me, represents a rather significant and noteworthy historical, philosophical, and methodological shift from how the subject had been essentially or effectively engaged in the past. So this is what I like to think of as a transition from what I want to call classical ufology to the emergence of an actual science of UAP or science of UFOs. So the story briefly is this: before there was something called, UAP studies, which is still, of course, emerging, there was something called ufology, right? And it's crucial to see that what is emerging now is, as I have suggested, a differentiation away from that earlier mode of inquiry. Classical ufology, as I understand it, was fundamentally forensic in nature, right? It dealt with reports of unidentified aerial phenomena, eyewitness testimony, trace cases, radar returns, and sought often retrospectively to determine, what happened, what caused those reports, right? What was the object cause of the person or persons making the report, right? What was it? The investigator, therefore, acted as a kind of detective, and the UFO case effectively was a kind of a cold case, right? And so ufology essentially is like a cold case chase, right? You want to go back, interview the witnesses, try to find any more trace evidence. You want to put that all together essentially into a forensic kind of report, and then you want to deduce like what was it, what happened, what was the thing there. And forensic inquiry, of course, has its virtues, right? I'm not saying it's not scientific, right? It collects, it catalogs, it compares, but it also has its limits, right? It works best when you already know what kinds of things can cause what kinds of traces. So sort of the first problem here in this, with classical ufology, insofar as it is a forensic pursuit, often the description of the behavior of the phenomena exceeds the ability for us to place it within the natural world in many cases. So you are not entirely sure what it is that could possibly even bring about the trace evidence that is left behind, whether it be witness testimony, burn marks, radiation, whatever it is, right? So this is a problem. When you're doing traditional forensics, right, you basically kind of know the ontological terrain. There are human beings, there is nature, there are the processes of nature, things have a certain degree of identifiability already in the background against which a forensic scientist will do their forensics. And then that forensic science happens on the basis of sciences which have already been demonstrated in their fundamental principles. And so a forensic scientist is just applying the principles of a science which is not forensic, which is what I would call a demonstrative science. And that's the other complication here, is that with respect to the specifics of these phenomena, it's not clear that we even have a science adequate to it. So that's another question. So, and again, this is not to deride or to denigrate, absolutely not. In fact, the opposite of ufology. But it's important to understand what its limits have always been and will continue to be, insofar as it is as ufology is a retrospective forensic mode of engaging these phenomena. When you don't have an understanding, right, of the causes, of even just the potential set of what the causes could be, you risk going in circles, right? You're left with reports about phenomena you cannot directly study because they're already gone. The perpetrator is usually not to be found. And you remain forever in the interpretive aftermath of an event that has essentially evaporated. Okay. In the absence of direct observation or experiment, right, classical ufology became essentially an archival discipline. A repository of reports, some reliable, some not, some well documented, others dubious, right? A mixture. One other problem here was that ufology never really achieved the status of a rigorous, professionalized discipline that, right, had a normative structure that guided it, right? That was due, right, to the sociological or cultural context of dismissal of the very idea, right, the very notion of UFOs. It was ridiculed, right, et cetera. And so you really couldn't ever have, in any sort of socially sanctioned sense, you could never really have the emergence of a professional investigatory field called ufology, right? It was always kind of this thing that happened, under the radar, so to speak, or it happened, on the off hours of somebody, pursued in a sort of amateur or amateurish way. It never really could sort of solidify, except in a few cases, of course. There were professional persons who were, dedicated clearly to it becoming a profession, but without general social sanctioning, right? It was always an uphill battle, right? It was always salmon swimming against the stream. But what happens, right, when you move from reports about phenomena to the phenomena themselves, when you start building instruments, designing observation protocols, and synchronizing data across multiple modalities of measurement, like, for example, Galileo Project, now in print in multiple papers, has articulated. Well, when you do that, you begin to shift from forensics to what I would call a kind of a demonstrative science. You move from an epistemology of testimony to an epistemology of data. And this is I would argue, is, when you think about it, it's a kind of obvious shift, but it's a shift that it's happening only in the last few years. But it's a very important, historically important, philosophically and methodologically important shift to recognize and to name as such. So this, I think, is the defining feature of the transition to UAP studies, the movement from an essentially retrospective pursuit, archival, etc., reconstructing what might have happened, to a prospective observational science of what is happening, which has the possibility of moving into experimentation, and ultimately, which is what we're all hoping, a realm of theory, of theorization and hypothesis testing. Okay. And so maybe in the next lectures, you'll hear a little bit more about that. Once that shift, you can advance to the next slide. Once that shift occurs, the question opens up in a new way. Because as soon as you begin to accumulate well-calibrated, correlated data, say, on objects moving with apparent kinematic profiles beyond known aerodynamic limits, you find yourself facing not just the question of what was observed, but of course, which is what we're all interested in, but of how such behavior could be possible at all, right? You move, in other words, from phenomenology, the description sort of, and recording and archival, compilation of the experiences of phenomena. You move from that to something more like an ontology, in which you begin to start to articulate how it is possible in nature to have these kinds of objects doing the things that allegedly, and from the reports, and hopefully in then the forward-looking data, is revealed to be occurring. And there, from that kind of ontology of nature, of how it is possible, right, on the basis of what physical principles these objects could possibly move, behave the way that they do, we can then, right, move clearly from that ontology to a potential agency, something behind that, those principles of nature, in fact, designing these phenomena, objects, to do the things that we see them to do. Right. And it's there, I think, that the bridge to the question of NHI begins to appear. In other words, the crucial connecting tissue is from the data that establishes clearly a ground from which we can then begin to answer how it is possible to have such kinds of objects, and to have confirmed, data that is produced on well-calibrated, well-correlated instrumentation that removes the doubt that there are these objects and they do manifest these physical characteristics, right? Once that is stabilized and we find room in our universe for such kinds of objects, room in nature for this, then we can start asking, I think, the question of agency once we isolate the ontology. So we can talk about that a little bit more later, but that, I think, is the bridge to the question of NHI, from, or at least one bridge from UAP to the question of NHI and a science thereof. So we can move, I think, to the next slide. So at this point, just give me a moment. At this point, it's worth situating that bridge, right, in a broader scientific context. We already have in SETI and astrobiology entire research programs dedicated to the question of extraterrestrial life and extraterrestrial intelligence. SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which everybody knows, has for many decades, of course, pursued the noble task of listening for signals, looking for signs, watching the sky for deliberate communications from elsewhere. UAP studies, by contrast, of course, we look locally. Right? This is one interesting contrast, right, which begins to make the question of NHI a bit more uncomfortable for the sciences. Right? It examines events rather than signals, mostly. Transient phenomena, sometimes instrumentally recorded, sometimes visually witnessed, that challenge known physical explanations in many cases. And there's a great variety of experience, of the UFO experience. I mean, I don't mean to, paste over all of that as if it were just one monolithic thing. There are lots of interesting classes of UAP experience or phenomena. And that is something, right, we have to, at the right moment, think about, right? But the important point here is that, UAP studies, at least as an empirical discipline, a discipline that looks at these phenomena empirically, it's a local pursuit, right? It examines events, as I said, not signals. Both domains, interestingly, are concerned, eventually at least, with intelligence. That is UAP studies and SETI, but they differ in how they imagine encountering it. For SETI, intelligence is something that encodes, transmits, and perhaps wishes to be understood, a producer of messages, right? For empirical UAP studies, intelligence, if it is present, appears sort of behaviorally, dynamically, as what I would call, or what I'm calling here, as an event of relation or relations, right? At a different order of analysis. So we could say that SETI seeks signal-like intelligence, while UAP studies would confront event-like intelligence in terms of the behavior of the objects, the structure of that behavior. And those two modes of inquiry are not just empirically distinct, they rest on, I think, entirely different epistemologies. SETI presupposes intentional communication, right? A cosmos, and it's not unreasonable. I mean, it's very reasonable, right? To presuppose a cosmos potentially full of interlocutors who might one day send us a greeting, unintentionally or intentionally. UAP studies, by contrast, encounters phenomena that may not be communicative at all, yet behave in ways that suggest coherent structure, or at least at a minimum, a degree of control that would suggest the operation of some heretofore unknown intelligence. It's important to note at this point that SETI, of course, is not unaware of this kind of a problem. The great Dr. John Elliott, whom I've met on several occasions, very brilliant scientist who works with SETI. He's at St. Andrews in the United Kingdom, great pioneer of SETI signals decoding. Because the problem is, as John puts it, once we get the signal, like, what do we do with it? You have to decode it, right? So essentially, John Alexander that's a Freudian slip. Dr. John Elliott, John Alexander is a different figure in the UAP world. John Elliott pioneered linguistics within SETI as a kind of like almost a no-brainer. I mean, you need to kind of take the signal. It's a structured signal of some kind, right? That's how you detect it in the first place. It has a certain kind of usually repetitive or curiously repeating signature of some kind, which distinguishes it from the rest of the sort of noise that is electromagnetic detections, right, from the cosmos. And presumably within that signal, that repeating signal, that can be reasonably attributed to a technological source. Inside that signal will be some kind of structure that will carry the communication, the message, right? It's embedded inside of that signal. You got to decode it. So that was what John Elliott's sort of great, pioneering insight is that you need to apply a kind of linguistics to the problem. But the point here is, rather than looking for the structural patterns within, right, technologically mediated signals, right, looking inside, for example, EM band patterns, we instead look for a distributed and potentially nonlinear or relational structure of patterns in the relevant event space, right? So we're not just looking at inside of an electromagnetic signal or whatever it happens to be that we're looking for, whatever kind of mediated communications carrier we're looking for, right? That's inside. Rather, we're looking at a structure of relationships that is distributed in space and possibly in time, in a certain event space, right? And that, I think, is what, when people in the UAP studies, in the empirical UAP studies field, when they turn to look at UAP and they situate it in terms of treating these objects as intelligent, they're essentially doing this, right? The SCU, for example, has this multi-part study they call it the Intentions Project. And that's exactly what I mean as an example of a relational sort of nonlinear distributed analysis, right, is where they situate the UAP in relation to other humanly significant things like nuclear sites, et cetera. And they look at those patterns of engagement between the UAP, right? And that pattern suggests the operation of some kind of intelligence. SCU, I think the authors want to attribute, well, they call it the intentions study, but even there, I think, is perhaps a little bit too much to attribute intentionality. Intelligence as a distributed fact that is distributed in the relevant event space, I think that is definitely key here. In other words, the message, as it were, is in the relations, right? It isn't necessarily going to be an electromagnetic signal. Rather, it's going to be something, right, in the structure of relationships, is the claim here. So that's what I mean by a higher order parameter space where physical signals are integrated with a behavioral pattern discernible from the objects whose physical characteristics that we are studying. So we put that together, possibly also with the ways in which the human witnesses are engaging these phenomena. This is the nonlinear dimension. That all will be part of what is studied in this higher order event space, right? We can talk a little bit more about that. But here is something more akin to what you might call sort of phenomenological linguistics, or a linguistic phenomenology of intelligence detection and so on. Indeed, a relevant methodology here is definitely, I think, part of the methodology here is surely what my colleague, Dr. Josh Pearson at the Society, and also who is with SCU, would call structured analytic techniques, or SATs, right? Which comes, of course, as many of you may know, from the intelligence studies community. Now, this isn't a small distinction because it means that the SETI model presupposes that intelligence will somehow show itself through recognizable order rather than through the grammar of signal and response, right? But perhaps that assumption already constrains what it is that we could ever find. Not to say, again, this is not to disparage SETI, it's just an attempt to distinguish between two different levels of analysis and two different focuses, right, in the studies. SETI studies signals mediated electromagnetically. Of course, you also then have the search for technosignatures, stuff like Dyson spheres and so on, which would be technological structures, which would be indicative of intelligence. The suggestion here is that it might not be obvious that you're dealing with a technological form. It might sometimes take that form, that shape, but it might be something more ambiguous, right? That we're dealing with, right? For example, you have various light phenomena that are sometimes reported that don't appear to be structured objects, but that nonetheless demonstrate some kind of engagement with the percipients, those who are encountering them, right? There are lots of cases like that. And so here, what you need to look at is really the structure of the behavior of the phenomena in relation to the context, the relational structure, and not just look at the object itself, because in these cases it doesn't obviously look like a technology, right? So we have to have, I think, a more general way of approaching the question of intelligence when the evidentiary base is something that you would call UAP, right? So this is sort of the distinction that I'm trying to characterize here. And again, SETI is a perfectly reasonable, right? I mean, maybe some intelligence will, of course, manifest technologically, and maybe it would be possible to detect that electromagnetically, whether it be optically or in the infrared band or with X-rays or gamma rays. It might be possible, right? So we should not look. But when it comes to UAP, I think that method is probably, right, is going to be extremely limited. Maybe when you're looking in deep space, it makes sense, but perhaps the nearer you go, the more that the method of detection, discovery, and study has to be more sophisticated, right? Again, because you're dealing possibly with more ambiguity in the data. All right. So again, we can talk about more about that. So in this sense, SETI is an exercise in recognition, not in discovery. It looks for the familiar, the patterned, the encoded, the semiotic. But what if intelligence, in some of its possible forms at least, does not communicate, or at least in any recognizable form, does not encode, does not manifest through recognizable order in any familiar sense? What if it appears ephemerally, relationally, contingently, more as an event than as a definite message, right? We also have to contend with the fact that perhaps if there is an intelligence at work in some of these, in some UAP cases or some classes of UAP, they might not actually care to engage with the human at all. We might, for various reasons, be a relatively minor aspect of the world in which they are interested in studying. So we have to also be mindful that we may not matter whatsoever, right? They may have actually a wider view of what is important, and we may just be one sort of small aspect of something. For them, for this form of intelligence might be more holistic, right? We might just be a part of a whole. So we have to have, right, methods that can potentially match that sort of that ephemerality, that elusiveness, and that kind of more general sort of operation. So at that point, that we can advance the next slides. At that point, the SETI paradigm reaches its limit. And something like UAP studies, I think, at least in the form of intelligence analysis, this is where it begins. And between them, between the communicative and the relational, there opens a kind of a gap, a philosophical lacuna, a missing middle. Neither SETI nor UAP studies, as they are currently conceived, provides a science of intelligence in and of itself. Okay, so this is missing, right, I think. We look for forms of intelligence. We might look for behavior, in the events that suggest intelligence. But what about a science of intelligence itself. Both presuppose that intelligence is something that we might already know how to detect, or at least recognize. But what if we don't? What if the problem of NHI is not a matter of missing data, but of missing categories, right? So we can advance to the next slide. So let's just take a step back for a minute. What would it even mean to speak of a science of intelligence? We do, of course, have sciences that study intelligence, right? I mean, this is not, this is not unfamiliar or unknown to us. We have comparative cognition, we have animal cognition, sciences of animal cognition and animal intelligence, cognitive neuroscience. We study ourselves. We also are building, and I guess also at the same time studying artificial intelligence, right? Something, a sort of a creation of our own design. We might even put scare quotes around intelligence, right? There's a debate, is it intelligent or not, AI, so to speak. But each of these is, in its way, a study, of course, of human intelligence, if only by analogy. They treat non-human terrestrial animal or artificial intelligence as variations, perhaps, on a human theme, or at least, right, in a certain align to human beings. A science of NHI would, I think, have to invert that, right? We would have to kind of alienate ourselves from ourselves in order to really, truly grasp the problem of intelligence. It would have to treat intelligence without reference to the human at all. There's a lot to say here, right? Surely, I mean, the universe is vast, and it is fairly clear that the universe is full of planets, right? And full of planets that are orbiting in just the right zone that would suggest the possibility of life emerging that, relatively similar to what we have on the Earth. But that's probably just a small subset of what might be possible, right? There is a whole field, right, of investigating sort of, very alien forms of life and what they could possibly be like. And the various evidentiary challenges of detecting life that would depart rather significantly from the sort of carbon-based life that we're all familiar with here on Earth, of which we have a single example, which is biological life on Earth alone. We have no other, right? We have no other examples, so we have no idea about how rare or how common are particular forms of life. But just the law of large numbers would suggest that since the universe is sort of teeming with planets of all sorts, it's not hard to imagine that it's possible, right? Question is, how is it possible, and what forms could it take? And that is only to talk about, right, biologically based life. Another whole field of inquiry, right? And I've been reading the work of the great NASA historian, philosopher of science, Stephen Dick, who's written. He's the guy you want to read for SETI, for astrobiology, right? For this whole topic of dealing with intelligence. And the nuances that are involved. But Stephen talks about, for example, post-biological life forms, right? And when you're talking about post-biological life forms, perhaps there is where it may get even more ambiguous, right? The kinds of forms that technology can take are sort of mind-boggling in varieties, potentially, right? I mean, you can imagine all kinds of sorts of technologies that all kinds of different biological intelligences might design. We only know a very narrow band of technological forms that human beings and some very few animals have created, right? But imagine, right? Technology is kind of the manipulation of nature by intelligent means, right, to achieve certain goals, certain ends. But the forms that it takes are as endless as the imagination in some sense, and what it is possible that we can imagine doing on the basis of being able to control ourselves and nature, right? In other words, the depth of our understanding of the physical principles of nature, of self, of world, determine the set of possible technological forms. And we're not even done with, if you think about it, the Newtonian science that was emergent in the 17th century. We're not even finished with all of working out all of the technological possibilities of Newton. And now you add in there quantum mechanics, and not to mention even relativity theory, right? What are all of the technological possibilities that are possible there? I mean, today we talk about quantum computers, right, and relativity. Even there, we talk about these days general relativity and warp drives and so on. But what's possible is only as limited as our imagination, it would seem. So, right. What we tend to study, though, in terms of intelligence is human intelligence, by analogy. It is a more challenging puzzle, right, to alienate ourselves from the human and then to imagine the space of possible non-human, radically non-human intelligences that are not terrestrial, that have no connection, for example, to our biological reference points that would make it sensible to even relate to a species that is not extraterrestrial, but shares, for example, similar biology to us. I mean, right? Imagine. So I think in general, the issue is that we treat non-human, even artificial intelligence as just variations on human themes. So post-biological, if artificial intelligence is a kind of post-biological life form or form of intelligence, it's still human by analogy, in a sense. Yeah. I mean, the algorithms, right, are comprehensible objects that are based on human logic. I mean, essentially, right? A science of NHI would have to invert that, as I said. It would have to treat intelligence without reference to the human. How do we do that, right? How is that possible? So let's define it, at least provisionally, not in anthropocentric terms, but in functional terms. Suppose we take intelligence to mean the capacity of a system to recognize patterns, to respond adaptively, and to construct internal modes of its environment sufficient for survival, communication, or creative interaction. I don't know if that's sufficiently abstract enough, but under this definition, intelligence becomes a kind of relational organization, not a substance, not a biological feature, but a behavior of systems. Okay, and it just will depend how you define the systems, right? So it's a very, it has a level of independence from the particular biology, right? Is what the virtue of that kind of definition is. And as such, it need not be limited to biological life as we know it, of course. It could, in principle, manifest across different substrates, organic, artificial, or otherwise. This would seem to be, of course, encroaching on the field of cybernetics, which attempted to engage and theorize such things. It is an intellectual field that we're exploring actually at the society. That's another story I'll pass over. But the challenge becomes, I think, here first epistemological. What kinds of evidence, what kinds of observation would allow us to recognize such a kind of organization when we see it? How would we distinguish the mere complexity from the genuinely intelligent? The danger here, right, and I'll be the first to admit it, if we allow the definition of intelligence to be too expansive, the problem is then what wouldn't be intelligent, right? Right. And so we have to play this game of, we can't narrow it so much so that we're only able to recognize and our methods of discovery and detection are only sufficient, right, to probe or analogously human intelligence. So we don't want it to be so narrow, right, to exclude many other forms of intelligence, including non-human intelligence right here on the planet Earth. But we don't want it to be so expansive, right, that just anything could be intelligent. This is in a sense the challenge, right? Perhaps most importantly, the question: how do we prevent ourselves from projecting intelligence onto phenomena that only reflect our own perceptual biases? This is the crux of what a science of NHI ultimately has to confront, not just the detection of other intelligence, but the recognition of our own limits in, right, being able to detect and recognize it elsewhere. So you can move to the slide 8, the epistemological problem of evidence. This brings us inevitably to that problem. Evidence is not a neutral thing. As, for example, as Gary Nolan, whom I think is the next speaker next month, as he very, very correctly, very, very importantly points out, evidence is structured by assumptions and instruments through which we collect it, right? Our scientific instruments are extensions of our sensory and conceptual apparatus, if you think about it. They measure what we expect the world to offer us as measurable. Right? There's a history of instrumentation, instrumented observation. It's very much focused on the eye, for example, with Galileo, the telescope, right? It is, in a sense, it's very constrained, very limited. And we've expanded beyond optical, right, to infrared and other bands of the electromagnetic spectrum. But that's all very much, right, engaging our perceptual apparatus, right? After all, even if something is detected in the X-ray band, somebody eventually has to engage it and interpret that, right, and produce an interpretation, a result, right? Evidence and data are not neutral. In a sense, evidence is human. So what happens when the phenomenon itself does not fit, of course, into those parameters? When, for instance, an event appears to behave intelligently but resists material capture or interacts with the observer in ways that blur the line between object and experience. What's really interesting about the Galileo project, right, and it's sort of implicit in their what they call the sort of science, the traceability matrix, right? What's really, really, really interesting in Galileo project is the fact that they don't only look at sort of optical, radar, infrared, but also sound, which is interesting. In certain cases, right, certain UAP cases, certain encounters often will have, as part of that encounter, an auditory experience, sometimes an olfactory experience, smell, right? And, if you think about it, this is also what I mean by the higher order event space, right? The events are characterized in physical terms, but we can't forget that the human body, right, is articulated with a number of different sensory capacities, not just the eye, not just, feeling, radiation, but also the sense of smell, the sense of touch, and this, and the sense of hearing, right? To integrate all of these together is, we would think, will also be a kind of, you might think, a signature of intelligence, potentially. So we have to remember that there is a potentially very higher order event space with which we have to integrate a lot of different modalities of evidence, including the encounter itself, right, as a qualitative experience that somebody has had, right, if we're going to look for the structure of an intelligence, is what I'm suggesting, right? It has to be much more holistic, right, much more relational, much more higher order, right, in terms of the description space. So that's the question. What happens when the phenomena doesn't fit those parameters, right? Electromagnetic radiation or whatever. What happens when, for instance, an event appears to behave intelligently but resists this kind of capture? Then we face what I have elsewhere called the epistemic loop of course, forensic indeterminacy. That is, the more extraordinary the claim, the more it depends on evidence that our current epistemic apparatus is not built to register. In classical ufology, the loop expresses itself as the endless stalemate between believers and skeptics. But at a deeper level, it marks a structural impasse, I argue, in the philosophy of science itself that's in play. Our current epistemology assumes, that phenomena are stable, repeatable, and external. But what if some are transient? What if some are participatory and relational in nature? In other words, we go from the outer space more towards what you might call as the experiential inner space. To study those, we would need a new kind of empiricism before we start speculating about things like telepathy and all sorts of paranormalities, that are sometimes reported in certain UAP encounters. We need a new kind of empiricism to listen to the data. And this is why early in the lecture, I stressed the need to let the experiences sort of speak. And that means let the experiencer speak, right? Before we begin to close it down. So that's what I mean by empiricism is an experience-first philosophy, right? If you look at the history of empiricism, it was one that always was skeptical of, if not even outright dismissive of, the metaphysical, the speculative, right? And it attempted to clear the way back to the basic experience, what nature, in a sense, is giving voice to through the human experience, right? That's how we learn about nature, right? It's embodied, right, in us. It's being articulated through us, right? So this is where, I begin to call for a new kind of empiricism before we heap on these phenomena all sorts of interpretations, even sometimes that the experiencer wants to give to their experience. We have to be really careful about that, right? So when you go back, for example, to the John, to some of the the most challenging kinds of encounters, like the Ariel school phenomenon, right? And you listen to those students, right? You hear, a pattern, a structure of phenomena emerging, right, in their descriptions. And it's not just an objective description of something that happened, right? It's also something happening to them. And that is also, right, part of the evidence. Now, what to make of that? This is where it becomes really challenging. Were some of the students receiving telepathic messages? Well, the problem is that we don't understand nature enough to be able to know that telepathy is a regular feature of the world, and we don't have a theory that relates, right, the various components involved in those alleged experiences. There's a lot of really great sort of suggestive evidence. There, of course, everybody knows the telepathy tapes these days. And there is cause for further investigation, but in terms of having a theoretical understanding of what underwrites these potential phenomena, in other words, the ontology is not there. So it's not clear what to make of this, right? And that's a theoretical challenge, as well as one of a challenge of the experience, interpreting that experience, right? They go together. So, and I can talk more about that in particular. So what I'm calling for here, right, is a new kind of empiricism, ontological simplicity, and metaphysical neutrality as far as possible, right? A new kind of empiricism that integrates both the objective and the experiential, or the so-called subjective, both the instrumental and the phenomenological. So I think that part of what it means to engage a radically non-human experience is going to have to involve, in a weird way, this kind of integrative empiricism experiential, the objective, the experiential, the instrumental, the phenomenological. We have to draw these two things together to be able to recognize the intelligence. This, I think, is the deeper challenge of a science of NHI. It is not only a scientific problem, but a philosophical one. It forces us to ask what it is that we even mean by evidence, by observation, and even, of course, the structure of reality itself. Yes, you can, I think, advance to the penultimate slide, from evidence to encounter, right? So if intelligence is, as I've suggested, a relational mode of organization among different systems, then the science of NHI would be first and foremost a science of relation, a relational science. You might even call it a holistic science, but I think holism might be an overused term. It's a science of relation. It would study not what an intelligence is, but how it manifests, how it relates, and how it interacts with the human observer. So you have a functional definition of intelligence, and then what you find is its manifestation through the how, right? Not the what. That keeps it, I think, open enough to where it is capable of dealing with radical forms of intelligence. Such a science would begin not with the assumption of communication, but with the possibility of encounter, of mutual intelligibility that may or may not take the form of messages or symbols. Right? I mean, it might not be that we're being communicated with. Is the point, right? It might be something else. It might be more like the interpretation of a work of art, ironically enough, which is a kind of communication. It may be one-sided, but it is perhaps a kind of communication, right? And I sort of mentioned this at the end. I mean, again, okay, we're trying to think outside the box here. In that sense, its methods would be phenomenological before they are technological. They would begin with attending carefully to the conditions of the appearances of how these phenomena are appearing and what the context is, right? How do such phenomena show themselves to us? What do they do to our expectations? How do they alter our frameworks of intelligibility? Right. There's a great paper that I was very proud of helping to edit and get published. We invited the great sociologist and ufologist Bertrand Meilloust, Dr. Bertrand Meilloust, who wrote a famous text that we're in the process of preparing the first definitive English translation of, called Science Fiction and Flying Saucers. Bertrand wrote a text for us, which I consider to be really a seminal paper on what he calls elusiveness, the elusiveness of the phenomena. And there, if you read this paper in Limina, he is interpreting, I think, what you might call a kind of structure of an intelligence, right? It has this elusive character that he tries to read, in a sense, as if it were a text. So we have to kind of think, sideways, backwards, underneath. We have to think, instead of direct on, it might have to be a sideways glance. And I think here, of course, is where a radical interdisciplinarity is, of course, necessary. We're not just studying physical behavior objects. That certainly isolates it or establishes these phenomena in the realm of the objective, right? Sensors, electromagnetic radiation, signals, blah, 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 right? But we need, right, to move from just UAP to the question of intelligence. Of course, we're going to need much more than that. Because, physics doesn't study, doesn't study intelligence. Physics doesn't even study the content of signals. It just studies the material, right? The characteristics, the physical properties, as far as the principles of nature allow, right? So we are definitely, I mean, many people say it, but this is a case, obviously, where I think that a radical kind of interdisciplinarity and integration, as Jason, right, suggested, almost like going back to the Middle Ages, right? We need to bring the sciences, the humanities, all of the disciplines that have differentiated themselves from one another and which are unfortunately usually mutually unintelligible to each other in terms of their specialized language. Perhaps this cluster of problems, the UAP, and then this passage into the question of intelligence, of non-human intelligence, maybe this is exactly a kind of science of the future, right, in which these streams once again come together for the study of a common structure of a problem, right? There are very beautiful things, I guess, we can say about that. Very hopeful things that we can say for the future of human knowledge to be reintegrated in very practical ways, right? I mean, UAP in a sense is a very practical problem, especially for the government, which needs, omni-domain awareness, and UAP essentially are evidence of where that fails. So there are practical problems, right, that I think would inspire this kind of integrative science, right? Radically interdisciplinary, where physicists, cognitive scientists, anthropologists, philosophers, we all study the elephant from different parts, but we don't know, right, what the whole thing is, right? And also artists. Let's not forget artists all working together on a single problem. What are the possible modes of relation between human and non-human intelligence, right? Okay, this is my utopian project, right? This is a little bit of wishful thinking, but, can we not dream, right? The quote instrument here would not only be the telescope or the sensor array, but of course, as many people are calling for these days, it would also be the trained consciousness, the disciplined phenomenological observer, the rigorous conceptual analyst, the experimental artist, that is to say, the human being. One of our lecturers, an anthropologist who is finishing her PhD, Maya Cohen, has discussed the concept of humans as sensors, as many others have done. Yes, it sounds ambitious, but all sciences begin with a conceptual expansion of the empirical itself, of nature, is probably what we really need here, an expansion, before we can contract, right? Finally, the open science of the possible. So perhaps the real question at the end of all this, coming back down to earth, right, is not whether non-human intelligence exists. The universe is old, vast, and creative enough that this, I think, seems a trivial possibility. The question is rather whether our sciences, our ways of knowing, are yet intelligent enough to perceive it. A science of NHI should, if it ever emerges, would not be a science about others, but a science that must become other to itself. A science that learns, adapts, and transforms in response to what it encounters. It would be a science of possibility, not closure, of openness, not mastery, I think. Okay, this is maybe a little bit utopian. And perhaps this is where, this is what UAP studies in its best and most disciplined form is gesturing toward, not simply the documentation of anomalies, but the reformation of the science attitude, the scientific attitude itself. A move from forensics to relation, from report to encounter, from knowledge as control to knowledge as a kind of an encounter, as a meeting. Okay, that's a little poetry. We have to end on a little bit of a poetic note. To study NHI in that sense is not to extend human intelligence necessarily outward, but to discover what intelligence itself might yet become in us, right? So we have to, in a sense, we have to expand as well when it learns to meet what is not itself. Thank you. Okay.
I'll put back here. There you go. Mike, you've said many things that I was trying to write down because the quotes is stuff that I've been trying to summarize for years. You were mentioning it's not evidence. Some of the stuff is not evidence we're missing. It's categories that we're missing. Like if we don't have the categories, we won't even know we're missing the evidence for that. And that's brilliant because that is an aspect that we never talk about are the missing pieces. What are we missing? And, as much as I have my biases in this field, I know I'm missing a bunch of stuff, not only because of stuff I want to dismiss, but because what is dismissed as a whole. So you brought up some great questions. I'm going to pass it over to Reed right now, and then we're going to come back with a few questions from the listeners.
Great. Thank you, Jason. Let's bring up Ted as well. Mike, thank you for the presentation. I think that was a phenomenal foundation for the investigation to come and how we would move forward with the scientific method and these kinds of approaches that you're outlining. So thank you very much for this.
You're welcome.
I know Ted and I have a few questions we'd like to ask. For those listening, please hit the link, or we can throw up the QR code where you can scan and ask your questions as well. And so if you don't mind, Ted, I'll begin here. So Mike, you elaborated on this shift from phenomenology to ontology to agency, and this epistemic loop, right? Which is the greater the claim, the greater the requirement of evidence, the less our ability to conceptually or even technically capture the evidence. So how do we break through? Well, first, how do we transition in those three stages? What is the fundamental requirement to go from phenomenology, what we experience or how things appear to us, to ontology, what things are, to agency, what things can do? And then how do we break through the epistemic loop to ultimately race down the road and gain empirical data in this new empiricism that you've described?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard trajectory to accomplish. I mean, first, the importance of phenomenology is in terms of the phenomenology of what I would call, or what I have called, the UFO experience. What's really important there, and again, my reference point here is the Galileo Project. They really stated it well when they characterized what I now call classical ufology, right, as when it's done well, what you're doing, right, is you're capturing the structure of the appearance of these phenomena. And that gives you indications about how to design the experiments that can produce the data that can give us the evidence for a certain theory, which then can explain how these phenomena are possible in the first place. When you begin to do theory, that's when you start to have to think about what is the ontological structure of the world, right, that can sustain that theoretical, those theoretical explanations. And then when you have a sort of sense of what the ontological horizon is, what it is that there is in the world, how it's structured, and how that structure makes it possible that these objects can do what it is that they're doing. On that basis, then you can kind of begin to talk about the agencies that are realizing these possibilities, which now you have theoretically substantiated in terms of your ontology, which grounds the scientific understanding. And I could give you just a simple example of that, right? So, when you way back in the very development of the scientific revolution, in order to understand, for example, gravity, right, you had to take the phenomenology, right, the experience of gravity, you had to kind of reduce it down, describe it, and give a sort of minimal kind of ontology of matter in motion, write down a sort of description of that in some representational space of mathematics. And then from there, you can kind of discover a law, and then that law is used as a kind of explanation. Now, interestingly enough, Newton didn't want to say exactly what gravity was, but he was able to sort of say what it does and how it functions. So I think that My ontology here is very sort of minimal. It's very relational. It's functional in that sort of Newtonian sense. It's neutral with respect to like the what is it really? In the 17th century, it could have still been angels. It could have still been vortices in the void. I mean, there are 100 different specific possibilities. But what Newton did was structure a series of relationships. He gave you that structure and said, here's the law. And here's how these bodies behave, right? I don't know what exactly gravity is, but here's how it functions, and here's the law. Yeah. So that's kind of what I mean, right? In moving from a kind of a very minimalist ontology, then to talk about agency. Now, to put agency back into the equation, it's hard because science doesn't really deal in agency, if you think about it. I mean, science eliminates agency. So this is where I'm calling, this is a new science, right? This requires an expansion of the horizon of what a science can really deal with, right? So
how would we operationalize this kind of framework? What would be the impact on actual field investigations happening now? How would they be done differently? Or how would we interpret reports or experiential data and fit it into this model so that we can move down the road and make better assessments of what it means?
Well, I mean, I think that the data, so there are three contexts in which the data and the evidence is examined. Well, 2 plus 1. I mean, we have to get the data, right? It has to be produced. It has to be recorded. So the question really is, look, if part of what we suspect here is the operation of an intelligence, then that's where the data gathering operation needs to include the whole range of modalities, right? Not just physical, but as you said in the beginning, right, qualitative.
Right.
So that search, that the ability for the data gathering operation to also be able to record qualitative data, experiential data, and so on, contextual information, that has to be structured from the very beginning, or else when we go downstream, we're not going to have the relevant holistic picture from which then to later be able to add agency back into the picture, where we have that ontological system of relationships, right? That is gleaned from the data. So we have to, I think, reimagine what it means to do data collection. And what was interesting when I was participating in this Arrow workshop is that they were really interested, and I found this significant. They were really interested in treating the qualitative aspects of the experience as data. And so they invited scholars whose entire scholarship revolves around trying to capture qualitative data in a rigorous fashion, as rigorous as it could be with the quantitative. Then the problem is, it's a very deep and it's a philosophical problem, because how do you capture experiential data? Is it just a narrative? Are there certain kinds of structures of questions that are revealing, that help characterize that more qualitative or experiential dimension, right? So my argument would be that it has to start from sort of ground zero of data gathering, instruments of data gathering, whether it be questionnaires or the ways in which the investigator engages the witnesses. But that's only the first sort of context. That's just sort of the classical ufological sort of mode, where you're gathering sort of testimony, right? There are the emergent science of UAP, of course, is strictly focused on physical recordings of physical data, physical information. And this is really important. And it's being done not in a forensic capacity, but in what I would say is a demonstrative context, in which the instruments are well understood, they're well calibrated, they're well characterized, so that any potential signal in those instruments will be validated by virtue of the quality of that instrumentation and the relationship between the various modalities that are integrated, for example, in the Galileo suites of instruments, where they have multiple sensor modalities recording at once. The missing component here, this again is a philosophical challenge, and this is why I'm calling for an expanded kind of empiricism. The missing dimension here, right, is is the experiential component, right? Sure, it's in principle, it should be possible to record, like something like the tic tac, right?
Mhm.
On multiple sensor modalities, right? That seems like reasonably, like the Galileo suites of instruments seem reasonably designed to be able to do that. However, what happens when you've got, what happens when you have the experiential dimension, right?
Mhm.
When people report a certain change in state, or their consciousness shifts, or you have these alterations in the perceptual field that are not necessarily obviously connected with the object, but are coincident, right?
Mhm.
So in other words, you need a holistic picture. And I'm just sort of repeating something that was said. I have on my desk here, The Edge of Reality, that famous dialogue between Hynek and Vallée in the 1970s. And they laid it out there. You need a science that is integrative and holistic enough to be able to capture the entire picture of not just the UAP or UFO as an object, but again, to use Hynek's term, you need to be able to have instruments that can record the UFO experience as it is happening as a whole, not just trying to recover that from testimonial accounts,
Right.
but live as it's occurring, to have the structure of those relationships at least recorded in a sort of a validated way. That I don't see. That's something
And
for
so
the
Ted, I want to bring you in because this is your field of expertise, is really working with experiential data from experiencers. And I guess a question to you both is, are you aware of any technological means of monitoring experience in a potential or hypothetical event, an encounter that would provide real data that would be indicative of the nature of this new relational space that you've called it, Mike? I think of technologies like Neuralink, computer to brain interface, et cetera. And we already have, you can go to your local hospital and they can scan your brain and look at evidence of probable experiences that have occurred. So how would that happen?
Well, we've made several jumps at that already, through MUFON and some other places that have put together instrument packs that are deployed in the spaces around experiencers, and some data has been gathered in that fashion. And there are other internet-based kits that have been online for a while now that are doing similar things. So I think, developing and working along that track wouldn't hurt when you're dealing with people who are claiming repeat experiences. Then you can start trying to collect some data off of that. And there are some other ideas on the horizon. I'm aware of some research looking at different types of weather radars and stuff that might be indicative of activities that could correlate to incidents.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least coincidentally correlate to incidents, So there are some ideas out there, and we've been working on these things for a while. But I think it all needs to come to a new level, and part of the problem is stigma. Getting a push against a mindset that doesn't want to go towards it.
Right.
That doesn't want to move towards trying to understand whether these things are, what anomalous really means.
And Ted, if you've got a question, I think you have a question on this for Mike about stigma, if you'd like to pose that.
Oh, sure. I'm just curious, Michael, how you're being received by your peers as you engage on this topic.
Well, I've been fortunate, I think, because, for example, the research position that I have now is already with people who study, what I like to call the empirical weird, the esoteric, the occult, occulture, magical practices, and so on. So they're kind of already cool with anything that's a little, strange. So they're good with that. And so therefore they're kind of already open to it. And so when I start to kind of begin with just the basic physical characteristics that have been reported, somewhat consistently in the literature, the classical UFO literature. They get really, really interested in, especially the fact that NASA and other government agencies have jumped in the game. That's where they're really interested in that. And I don't, I'm lucky. I have to say I'm pretty lucky. Usually what really turns people is I'm like, look, we could play this game of maybe Dave Fravor didn't see what he saw. But, if you just give me a close encounter like that, multiple other pilots reporting it in this one case, either, they're lying or, okay, they could have completely, missed, their perceptual apparatus was consistently across all pilots was somehow misleading. Or you've got a truly puzzling case with really strange details. And that really just calls for, that usually will arrest people in their tracks and kind of think about, oh, wait a minute. Yeah. And so if you start kind of there and then, you sort of work out to increasing levels of strangeness there, you can kind of bring people in and just kind of at least suspend the disbelief. And that's really, I think that's the secret here is, look, you might ultimately think there's nothing here, but suspend your disbelief for a moment and let's just suppose. That's what kind of got me interested in this. It was specifically the Nimitz case, right? And Kevin Knuth's paper where they figured the characteristics. Just suppose that it is the case that, in fact, Dave Fravor and his colleagues were seeing something and describing it accurately. What the hell is it that we're dealing with? And that is a true, that's a true enigma. And then you read the literature, you find other cases that are similar, you build a phenomenological profile of this class of cases demonstrating extraordinary kinematics, also caught on radar, visual as well. It's a classic radar visual case, as we say in the field. That builds a level of solidity there to that. And then you're like, okay, there's something really here. And, how do we work this into a rigorous sort of scientific kind of a project? And that's exactly in 2021. That's what blossomed into Galileo project. And that's where I was like, all right, there's a lot of work to be done. There is that objective weirdness there. How the hell is that kinematics possible? How can you do 45 Gs plus? And then you've got that experiential component. But we just don't know how to integrate these two sides of the puzzle, right? And that's where in science, we need to do a lot of fundamental work that is philosophical, right? In trying to think of methodologies which don't already split the world into these two pieces, the material and the experiential, but which already starts from this integral sort of perspective. Now, I don't have a magic solution. I am organizing, different workshops and retreats on the question, because I want to dive right into the weird stuff, like the stuff like Michael Bolender, one of our colleagues at the Society, at his Soul conference talk, which was great. He's going there. He's going to the abduction stuff, right? He's going to that experiencer stuff, which we just don't know how to touch it in terms of science and scholarship. That's really the final frontier, is that core experiential component. We just don't know how to engage that. And I really applauded Michael Bolender in his attempt to take, sort of a juridical, sort of legal approach to put, as he put it, agency back into the experiencer and give the experiencer the voice back. Right. But we don't know how to treat that. Michael is uncomfortable with treating it as evidence. I don't think so. I think that science can be expanded beyond, he's worried about sort of framing the experiential stuff into a natural sciences paradigm. And he's correct. If you do that, you squeeze out, right, the content, and you can't get to that content. But I really believe in my heart of hearts that science is capable of expanding. We have had, experiential sciences before. Let's look in the dustbin of history. Like in the Middle Ages, you had an integral science. You had Aristotelian science, which was a very integral view, right? Of course, we gave up on a lot of that with the emergence of Newtonian physics, etc. But there may be techniques, methods, right, that can help us bring that experiential back into the method from the very beginning. So like when you talk about Neuralink and so on, that's really interesting. But the problem is that just gets you to the brain.
Mm-hmm.
The point is, what about my conscious experience?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which is inside, in a sense, right? And it's a problem because, right, the brain is a very subtle and, sort of plastic object in terms of mapping consciousness, right, and function. And it has a weird capacity, at least early on. I mean, there's a temporal factor, but damage in one part, if it's early on enough, it will just somehow recover that functionality and map it somewhere else. So there's this kind of degree of neuroplasticity, meaning that the centers of consciousness, which you can detect in relation to my conscious states, they don't map one to one. I mean, they generally do, but they don't, the brain doesn't work like that. So there are these mysteries, right, about how to relate consciousness, our conscious experience, that first person, to the objective third person. And you don't need UAP, you don't need, contact, you don't need abduction, you don't need any of that to make that already it's a problem in science, right?
Exactly, right. I mean,
already
this is, so much of UAP and potential NHI confronts us with what we would need to do anyway to get our species ready to understand reality, no matter when and where it comes to us. I want to transition to the listener questions, and we'll have to close up at the top of the hour. So let's put those on screen. I'm just going to, got two of my own there. I want to go to somebody else's. We'll go to that third one in the list. Do you think there may be some core hypothesis that can at least work effectively as a baseline to investigate other options, even if said hypothesis is falsified, i.e. investigating the ETI hypothesis? Oh, there we go. Would inevitably lead to the same data of other explanations if they are accurate. Your thoughts?
I have to think about that one.
It's kind of like rule one thing in because it can work along multiple hypothetical lines to follow.
Do you think there may be some core hypotheses that can at least work effectively? Yeah, I think so. Right. I mean, I do think that there are some core hypotheses. I see the question. So, look, I mean, I'm just sort of operating at a very high level. I'm just kind of making my sort of philosophical entry here. But there are people that are kind of doing this in a much more concrete way, right? And I think which can fit into this more philosophical articulation of this, what I call the relational framework. For example, like at the Society, we have our conference next month. It's in December. Everybody should register. We're opening up registration soon. But there, in fact, I think, Michael Glosson, Jason, I don't know, UAP Studies podcast, right? Isn't this the same?
Yes.
Yeah, Michael. So Michael Glosson is going to do a really fascinating talk with another brilliant researcher. These guys are great. Michael's a philosopher of science. I think he focused on biology. But we've got this new guy. I think he's an up and coming figure, I think, in this field with Michael. Corey Bauer, I think he's got his PhD just from Cornell University, if I'm not mistaken. And I think he's working at a research laboratory out in California. It might be Los Alamos. But in any case, he has developed, and I think with Michael, he's going to be elaborating on this, a hypothetical framework for trying to kind of make sense of at least a class of UAP. And his hypothesis is it's just pretty simple. He's just exploring, a basic hypothesis that says that, look, things like the Nimitz object, and other seemingly structured objects, spheres and so on, orbs maybe. It might be the case that they're a kind of probe, and if they are a kind of probe, what are all of the implications of that particular kind of hypothesis? And what they're trying to sort of demonstrate, whether or not that is true, is just how you can start to integrate different classes and different sorts of cases together and unify them under one sort of hypothesis. By the way, I think it's important also to recognize that, when we talk about hypotheses, we have to talk about those as Gary Nolan very importantly and always points out, you have to talk about that in relation to some evidence.
Right.
Evidence and hypothesis go together, and not all hypotheses can explain, right, all the evidence. So hypotheses will be able to explain some of the evidence and not others, and especially I think for UAP, because I think UAP is in many ways it's an inaccurate term because we're talking about a class. This is something that Kevin Knuth frequently reminds us about. We're talking about a class of very diverse kinds of phenomena, at least just from the phenomenology, right? The description of how these things appear and what it is that seems to be appearing, right? Sometimes you've got luminous phenomena, sometimes you've got structured objects, sometimes you've got morphological variations in the so you've got classes, right? And so hypotheses are not going to be able to deal with all members of all of the classes, but only some classes, and even maybe some members of each class. So we have to be really careful that this is a very complicated evidence terrain, and that the hypotheses really have to be, I think, tailored to fit certain classes so that we can start to at least explain in part UAP, not Michael, as a whole. I don't think there's going to be a grand, unified theory,
right. Mike, I advocate a lot, of identifying the key variables that would need to be ruled in instead of trying to rule everything else out. And I want to ask about biology and biologics. We've heard multiple claims in the congressional testimony. David Grush, 2023, Jay Stratton in the upcoming Age of Disclosure documentary. I was actually just reading in the history and origin of Kona Blue. This is from the Arrow office, their official documentation. Arrow first learned of the Kona Blue program from interviews conducted as part of its historical review. Multiple interviewees identified Kona Blue as a Department of Homeland Security sensitive compartment established to protect the retrieval and exploitation of non-human biologics. And so we've got these statements being made. How would you regard this as a potential variable at play, as a potential hypothesis within a larger, variety of phenomena? And how do we ultimately validate these claims?
Well, yeah, I mean, that I guess comes first. I can't work with those claims unless I can validate them. And there it's pretty direct. I mean, they're just saying that there are these biological, organisms that are, presumably not living anymore, that exist. I mean, there's nothing, there's no inner space question. There's no strange conscious states that we have to worry about and nuance our notion of evidence. So there it seems pretty straightforward. So I would say, okay, let's see it.
Right.
And if all we have is the testimony of individuals for which we do not have independent access to the informational ecosystems and other informational situation to which they had access,
right,
then there's no way of independently confirming that, despite the fact that we might, believe that they're fairly credible. It's perfectly fine. But from the point of view of a citizen, sort of, just the member of the general public, according to just general critical thinking standards, we would have to firstly have the evidence. It can't just be on testimony, because look, if it's going to become scientific, it has to be, and it's alleged to be a material structure, a biological structure, that then it can be subjected to biological analysis. Unless that happens, we don't know, right? We don't know what it is that we're dealing with. But look, I mean, it is an interesting problem, and this is where someone like Gary Nolan, there's people in our organization who are biologists, neurologists, right, neuroscience folks. That's an interesting question. So let's just roll up the sleeves and start talking about what it would mean to, have maybe not intact biological structures, but just material, right? What would it mean to deduce that that material was of a non-human biological entity? What would the roadmap from data to evidence to hypothesis look like? What would the standards of evidence have to be, et cetera, et cetera? What are the complexities there? We already know that, trying to deduce that a particular material object, not living, right, inorganic, like the Ubatuba sample or an alleged, material that comes from a UAP, that's already challenging, right? And Gary, has innovated this method of looking at objects at the atomic, and even perhaps even a smaller subatomic scale to see how the object is structured, right? In detail, in atomic detail, which is something that we typically don't do. That might indicate interesting engineering. There's also the question of, trying to figure out the isotopic ratio of the material, right? Whether it can be attributed to this solar system, or not, and so on. So there are those complexities. And so the question is, if we had non-intact biological material alleged to come from a non-human intelligence, what would the science of that look like?
I'd like to put up a question from a viewer, a very basic question, which expresses exactly what we're talking about here. We'll just put that on screen here, about the empiricism, this new empiricism that you're talking about, Mike. What about the gathering of the empirical evidence? So what do we do to potentially gather biological, physical, organic material or data ourselves if the government is unwilling to proffer it? I would imagine, the ontological shock, it's very evident if biology was disclosed, how that would move us from phenomenology to ontology all the way to
pretty quick
critical questions of agency, right? And so if there's any reason for a cover-up and a resistance to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, that might be a reason. But, so what do we need to go empirically gather as a society, as citizen or academic research groups, detection and tracking groups? And then to your question, Mike, is if biologics or physical entities were confirmed or affirmed by governments, how would that be validated? What would be the course of action?
Well, for me, the course of action is clear. In science, it's fine to make claims and then make claims about the existence of evidence or data, but then that has to be opened up for general scientific inquiry of other research teams, other individuals. And unfortunately, right, the U.S. government, as many modern nation states do, they operate within the constraints of the national security state. So therefore, information is unfortunately, structured in that way, classification, et cetera, right? So it's hard to get anything from government. So that's why I think it's kind of a lost cause to worry about that. What really we should be focusing on is developing the independent scientific apparatus that could function in a way as a meter stick, as a baseline for measuring claims, for measuring, the extent to which any particular claim about X, Y, or Z is credible. If we have a body of scientific evidence and data and a research program that is producing that data and evidence, we can measure these claims against that. That's what we have anyway. If somebody makes a claim about fusion, cold fusion or something, well, we have a relatively well worked out, physical science that can answer that to the extent to which the particular claims there are credible or not, based on our understanding. Now, if there's the interesting thing is if there's a breakthrough, then that breakthrough ought to be repeatable, right, according to the usual methods of experimentation, and the procedure that the scientist has or the team has undergone should be something that can be replicated, so that the phenomena being claimed can be, of course, reproduced. Of course, in the case of a biological entity, we're not talking about reproduction. We're simply talking about, because we can't make more of them, obviously. We're just talking about analysis of material. So that material would have to be made available. It's pretty simple, right? So.
Ted, if you'd like to ask a question.
Sure. The Open Science Foundation offers guidelines for research and publication for scientific journals. There's a lot of signatories, including the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. All of their journals follow what they call the TOPS recommendation. Are you familiar with these in terms of, setting standards for research and publication? Because what part of the standards, like with medical publication, is to make all data available, to set it aside so that when somebody reads your paper, they can go look at the archive of your data and see what they think of it.
That's right.
I kind of propose that ufology embrace this idea and start to engage, at a high level with following standards of research and publication, even if it's for our own journals. So this is more of a statement than a question. But
yeah, I mean, I would just sort of add to that the practice of ufology, I think, needs at least one or two things to happen, right? We have to first recognize that, classical ufology is, unless you mean something different, is a forensic practice. And there are forensic methodologies, right, that have been worked out in terms of criminology, in terms of law enforcement. And in fact, I have a team working out a working group specifically to bring together people who are knowledgeable in forensic science, in criminology, in the professional fields of forensic case investigation, to bring that to bear, to professionalize the classical practice of ufology, to get it systematized. Then with that in place, you can figure out. So I understand that I operate as a ufologist within certain forensic limitations. It's not wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. But I have to be clear about what those limits are and how my work relates to the more strict demonstrative sciences, and how the classical pursuit of case reports and recording and archival research can, in fact, as the Galileo Project pointed out itself, how it can actually, in a structured way, inform the design of experiment. I think that's the crucial sort of connecting tissue between the classical, historical, and archival tradition of ufology and the emerging new science. There needs to be a sort of a system, a professional sort of a nexus, if you will, so that the results of the ufological work can inform and help to govern, guide, and direct future demonstrative scientific research. And then likewise, as we get results in the demonstrative scientific context, which is more rigorous and more strict and non-forensic, that can then inform vice versa, the practice of ufology. We need like a virtuous circle, right?
I agree.
Once we have that clarity about the methodological foundations of classical ufology as a forensic practice, then we can start talking about standards. But I think until we do that, standards are going to be just sort of, we're going to be shooting from the hip. We need to begin somewhere, and we should start with the existing traditions of forensic science that have been worked out for at least a century and a half. I think it goes back to the 19th century in Britain, for example, in criminology. So we've got to link the ufological and get serious about it and make it a professional discipline, and then show how that can inform the science and how the science can then likewise back inform the practice of ufology. And that's the dream. Then you can talk about standards and, and then you're cooking. So,
well, Mike, we're at the top of the hour. It's been a fascinating, enlightening, foundational presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The next speaker in the series will be Dr. Gary Nolan on December 12th. And just final thoughts, Mike, in terms of operationalizing some of these insights, the research pathway going forward, anything you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, we need three things happening, right? We need, of course, and the society, and we're going to be, inviting many members of the community to join us. But this needs to be a collective effort on three fronts: the standards of evidence for the demonstrative science. We need the professionalization of ufology as a forensic practice. and we need to face head on the kind of the weird, the experiential, the first person experience. We need to put that center focus in a matrix where other scholarly fields can engage it: consciousness studies, neuroscience, cognitive science, philosophy, etc., to tackle that. And all three, I think, cover the entire field. So that's what we need to be really working on: building coalitions, working groups, producing white papers, and deciding what are our standards that we're going to evaluate our work going forward by. So those are my final thoughts.
Thank you, Mike.
You're
So
welcome.
important. Great closing calls to action.
Yeah.
UAP Med, Human Institute stand behind all of that, and we want to encourage the same things with
Thanks.
Society for UAP Studies and other organizations in the space. So thank you again for giving this inaugural talk and
You're
getting
welcome.
this series kicked off. And welcome to the new field of inquiry,
Nice.
right? It's as interdisciplinary as we can handle.
Yeah.
And so, get ready for an exciting, enlightening, mind-expanding ride into reality, if nothing else. So
Thanks.
thank you so much, Mike.
Take care. Good night.
Thank you. And for those watching, thank you for being here for this first presentation in the journey into investigating non-human intelligence. I encourage you, scan the QR code on the left, look at the upcoming speaker list, which we will be updating in the next few days. We have another 5 or 6 speakers confirmed, and we're going to be scheduling them out according to the 8 layers of the inquiry that I presented at the beginning. Please like, subscribe, share this channel, this video. It helps this get to more people, which is super important. And then last, if you would like to be considered for as a speaker in the series, or to join a panel, or even to present just an abstract or a paper for publication, please reach out to humaninstitute.org/submit. And the Human Institute and UAP Med will collaborate on examining your work and getting back in touch with you to look at whether it can have a place on this new stage that we are building. So with that, I'll say good night. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you on December 12th for the presentation by Dr. Gary Nolan on research roadmaps for investigating non-human intelligence. And with that, I'll say good night. Thank you.